From 1867 to 1870, the Republican-led Congress was very activist in trying to impose these changes on the South. But the political cycle turns, and Republicans lost some power in Congress, and many Republicans lost interest in the South. While they did have examples of people rising up from being enslaved to being in Congress, that was by far the minority experience. Most of the enslaved people were uneducated people who had lived on the farm all of their lives. They were not all Frederick Douglass. And a lot of Republicans were disillusioned with the enslaved people. They began to listen to some of the things that the white Southerners said and believe that maybe the African Americans were not worth saving. And that opened the door to this period of redemption, which was this long period of white supremacist Southerners reclaiming political and social control in the South. The class that you are taking ends technically in 1877. Traditionally, we put a stop on redemption, saying it ends in 1877 when Rutherford B. Hayes is elected. But I really think this idea of redemption continues right on into the 1890s as they are passing more and more discriminatory legislation. In 1877, African Americans still had significant rights in the South. It's not until nearly 1900 that legislation and social oppression are able to fully restrict African Americans from exercising their civil rights. The reversal of Reconstruction began with the restoration of Confederate land. Initially, General Sherman had said land is going to be seized from white landowners and given to the enslaved people. That was reversed by President Andrew Johnson during presidential Reconstruction, and there was never the congressional will to fully seize land from former enslavers. So the African American community was stuck into tenancy, renting the land, rather than a significant number of people getting to own land themselves. There was a general amnesty given to Confederates between 1865 and 1867, which included the restoration of the land to most pre-Civil War landowners. That established sharecropping by the later 1870s as the primary economic relationship in the South. In sharecropping, a landowner, usually a white person, owns a huge amount of land, which is cut up into family-sized plots. Each small family is given a lease on one small plot of land. Since that family doesn't have any cash money to pay the rent in, and they don't have any tools of their own, they have to borrow money from the landowner right at the outset to borrow money that pays the rent, to borrow tools, and then those loans are paid back with a share of the crop that is raised. Sharecropping allowed significant economic exploitation through the manipulation of credit and debt. The huge majority of sharecroppers were illiterate and innumerate. They could not read and they did not understand mathematics. So when they were told at the end of the year, here is the amount that you owe for your rent, for your tools, for the food that you purchased from me, they had no recourse but to pay it. And often that would take a much larger share of their crop than they had expected, so that they would then have to pay more money for the next year in order to get the tools, to get the food they needed to feed their family. So it developed this cycle of credit and debt that is known as debt peonage, which simply means that you're held in a simple location through debt exploitation rather than legal exploitation. Sharecropping was primarily a method of economic exploitation, but it also gave the landowners political leverage over their tenants. The tenants were dependent on that plot of land for a place to live, for being able to feed their families, for every sort of stability that they had. So it was very easy for a landowner to tell his tenants who they ought to vote for, to pressure them into voting for Democratic candidates instead of Republican candidates that those people might prefer to support. There's also an expansion of convict leasing. Convict leasing is renting out people who have been convicted of a crime in order to perform labor. And it's something that was done prior to the Civil War, and it was done even with white prisoners. People wanted to be the wardens of prisons because then they got to make a profit off the prisoners however they wanted to. And that system of renting out or selling convict labor was translated in the South to large-scale convict leasing. It was not always African American people who were incarcerated and then leased out, but it was certainly predominantly African American people. Convict leasing was also an economic system of exploitation. It survives in some forms even today. It was one of the issues with mass incarceration, that people who own for-profit prisons are profiting off of the incarceration of people, particularly in the South, but all across the country. This is still an issue of the criminal justice system that is in need of reform. As it was developed in the South, incarcerated people, usually but not always men, were forced into gang-style labor. This is partially what distinguishes it from sharecropping. Under sharecropping, African American families are working an individual plot of land that family is in control of. Convict labor was usually worked in gangs identical to the old system of slavery, where they are all set together on one field to do one task, all together as a huge group. Because there was a huge demand for this gang-style labor in cotton fields, it was seen as being more efficient than family-based labor. The system of convict leasing was accompanied by an increase in offenses that had incarceration as a punishment. So at this period in the South, you see the creation of laws that are really just meant to trap people and have them convicted of crimes. Vagrancy was being in a county without a job. That's all. You don't have a job? Oh, we're going to send you to jail. Being in debt, you can be incarcerated for being in debt, so it works along with that system of debt peonage. Crimes like jaywalking, vandalism, resisting arrest, these crimes are not things that endanger the community, but by carrying incarceration as a punishment, it allowed these southern communities to reclaim their enslaved population, this time under the guise of punishment for a crime, which is permitted by the 13th Amendment. The effect of it was to create a really enduring connection between Black men and criminality. The expectation in the South was that any Black man was dangerous. He was likely to commit a crime, and that perception has certainly continued to the present day, to the expectation that there is some danger in simply the body of a Black man. While they were making these economic and legal inroads against Reconstruction, the Southern Democrats were also working at the federal laws that had created and supported the earlier period of Reconstruction. Beginning with the slaughterhouse cases in 1873, the Supreme Court came to the conclusion that the 14th and 15th Amendment didn't actually apply to all citizens of the United States, but only to former slaves, so that not everybody got equality before the law. And you might say, well, of course, they were written for enslaved people. Of course, they were written for that population. But by narrowing it down, by saying, no, this doesn't actually apply to everybody, it actually made it easier to try and pick the amendments themselves apart, to say that they themselves were discriminatory because they didn't apply to all Americans equally. Similarly, in the U.S. versus Reese in 1876, the Supreme Court held that the 15th Amendment only talked about directly racial limits on the vote. They said that if a restriction did not explicitly say a racial reason for restricting people from the vote, then it was fine. Many African Americans were illiterate. Therefore, an illiteracy clause prevented them from voting. Many African Americans were very poor, could not afford to pay a poll tax. Therefore, a poll tax prevented them from voting. The U.S. versus Reese said, that's perfectly fine. That's an okay way to exclude people from the vote. And then in 1883, U.S. versus Harris struck down the Reconstruction-era Ku Klux Klan Act, which tried to act against domestic terrorism by saying that such domestic terrorism regulating the actions of individuals could only be passed by states and not by the federal government. And of course, states that were becoming controlled by the Democratic Party were not inclined to pass laws stopping the Klan and other similar organizations. While they were attacking African Americans economically, legally, politically, white men and women in the South were also physically attacking African Americans. Race relations in the United States had always been founded on violence, right? From the beginning, slavery was a system of violence. The simple fact that African Americans had been freed did not end the violence. The Ku Klux Klan was established in 1865 as a method of suppressing African Americans when former Confederates were restricted from the vote and restricted from economic and political participation. This map shows the murders and the lynchings that we know about of African Americans between 1864 and 1877. You see the big blotches in Memphis, in New Orleans. There were riots against African American communities there in 1866, and we don't know how many people were killed. Every part of Reconstruction was dangerous for African Americans because there was no limit from the white community of the violence that they were willing to enact on people that they had previously held as property. By 1870, Democrats hit on a way that they could re-enter the political system. Between 1867 and 1870, the majority of Democrats had been sitting out of the political system, had simply said, we don't want to participate with these people that beat us in a war. In 1870, a faction of Democrats who called themselves the Redeemer Democrats gave in. They said, okay, we will participate in the federal system. We will play by your rules in order to regain political control. They went back to the political system. They went through the actions they needed to regain the vote. and began to rebuild the Democratic Party as a legitimate political party in the South. That pulled the scalawags back into the party. So the people who had been cooperating with the Republicans see that the Democrats reemerge as a viable political party, and they shift back to voting for the Democrats. The Republicans in the South depended on African American turnout. Very few white men voted for Republicans, especially after the Democrats re-entered the scene after 1867. African Americans were supported by white Republicans who came in from the North, but the huge majority of African Americans in the South lived surrounded by white Democrats. They were terrorized by the Ku Klux Klan. They were suppressed by their landowners and coerced into voting for Democrats. The 15th Amendment was rendered ineffective by Supreme Court decisions so that they could exclude people based on their literacy, based on their poverty. And sometimes it was outright physical force forcing African Americans to vote for Democratic candidates. So they pulled the votes away from Republicans and forced African Americans to vote for Democratic candidates. From 1868 onward, Democrats regained seats in the House of Representatives and then the Senate. For a few reasons. It was not only this violence against African Americans. The very repeal of slavery, the 13th Amendment, ended the Three-Fifths Compromise, which meant that the South automatically got more seats in the House of Representatives. That was good for the Republicans at first, but as more coercion turned African Americans away from voting or toward the Democrats took advantage of those increased seats in the House of Representatives. In the North, Northerners in general got tired of Reconstruction. They saw this lack of progress as they saw it among African Americans. They were very impatient and felt the African Americans should be doing for themselves. They've been free for 5 years. What's going on? Why haven't they, all become Frederick Douglass? And so they began to turn toward the Northern Democrats. And the Republicans lost their own momentum and they lost the seats in Congress.